Okay, in our last class, we ended on the note of Vicente Guerrero, the president of Mexico, acting on the issue of slavery. We talked about his decree of September 15th, 1829, which had already which ended slavery throughout Mexico. Now, this put the national government of Mexico at direct odds with what was going on in Texas with regard to slavery. So we are really, with Guerrero's edict and all of that, we really are setting up for the beginning of the end between Texas and Mexico. So let's actually get there and see how this transpires. The issue, the fight, once again, when it comes down to slavery, boiled down to the liberals versus conservatives within Mexico. And these liberals, remember, are the Federalists, and the conservatives within Mexico are the Centralists. And remember, this is a long-standing problem in Mexico, or relatively long-standing, given that Mexico hadn't really been an independent nation for very long. But this is the crisis throughout Mexico's short history at this point. The leaders of the liberal Federalists were instrumental in bringing in the impresarios into Texas in the first place. So for them, it made sense that these same leaders would continue to support the impresarios, to support the aims that the colonists had in the late 1820s, the settlers, people who are coming in from the United States into Texas. These people thought that economic success in the region depended on exemptions from taxes for cotton. They depended on foreign imports and on free trade. They were willing to give citizenship to Americans like James Bowie, who had brought with him a permit and a blueprint for textile mills, so that there was the ability to have an internal market for cotton within the nation state of Mexico. And when it comes right down to it, all of the Federalists believed that slave labor was absolutely necessary for the success of Texas, plain and simple. Now, the Centralists, on the other hand, remember, these are people who are committed to stopping Anglo-colonization. They thought that things had gone way too far. They thought that slavery was against everything that Mexico had fought for during their own liberation. They sought to reinforce the presidios, to limit immigration, all of that sort of stuff. Now, Austin, meanwhile, was mirroring what was going on in Coahuila. They too saw the future as cotton cultivation. So they were working to legalize slavery. One of the early victories in all of this stuff, and I know I'm a little bit of ahead here, one of the early victories was a decree passed in May of 1828. This validated the contracts of servitude made in foreign countries. So in short, what this meant is that emigres could bring their quote-unquote servants with them. To make this work within the law, the Texas delegate to the state legislature, the Coahuila y Tejas state legislature, the delegate was a guy named Jose Antonio Navarro, and he sponsored a bill that would allow colonists to bring their slaves into Texas as, quote, permanently indentured servants. Now, liberals in Coahuila y Tejas had a real problem on their hands with all of this, especially with this law. They are now out of step with both national and with state politics. The Centralists had committed to stopping both Anglo-colonization and slavery, preferring what they were kind of referring to as counter-colonization from the interior of Mexico outward. So they were looking to bring people from places like Mexico City, from the Yucatan Peninsula, and promise them land and opportunities if they would move upward, essentially. So these conservatives, this is why I mentioned on a previous slide, they were reinforcing the presidios. They favored reinforcing the presidios to protect this sort of counter-colonization at all of these things. And they're doing this at places like San Antonio, at Goliad, at Nacogdoches. They built new ones at places like Velasco and Anahuac, just north of Galveston. The point of these two was of these Presidios was to be a symbol to discourage immigration by sea, to discourage these people from the United States coming in to Texas. So in September of 1830, the state Congress, Coahuila y Tejas' state legislature, expelled one of the Texas delegates. And the ayuntamientos, the city councils of Bexar, Goliad, and San Felipe de Austin, proclaimed that only constituents, only the voters in those particular regions, could determine whether their deputy could serve in the Congress, not the Congress itself. So in doing so, in making this statement, the Tejanos in those ayuntamientos were committing themselves to the liberal, to the federalist standard and all of this stuff. Now, a radical faction, a radical federalist faction emerged, and this radical faction was comprised almost exclusively of Anglos, and they started calling themselves the War Party. And unfortunately to say this, it's unfortunate to say this, they're more important to this story than those Tejanos who were fighting for the rights of the constituents and for the ayuntamientos. The troubles began to escalate in 1832 between the settlers and the authorities. The Mexican government was now enforcing new trade policies in the Gulf of Mexico, including collection of tariff revenues, which they had not been doing. And the new post at Anahuac was right in the middle of this. A colonel named Juan Davis Bradburn, an Anglo adventurer and a centralist, arrested a man named William Barrett Travis, the guy pictured on the screen here. Travis was attempting to deceive officials in getting the release of 2 runaway slaves to his own custody, to Travis's custody. A group of vigilantes gathered to protest the arrest of Travis and to demand that Travis would be released. When Bradburn refused, these settlers labeled Bradburn as quote-unquote a despot, because these Anglo settlers were used to the United States tradition of a separation of military and civilian law, and that's not what's happening here in Anahuac. Colonel Bradburn is a Mexican official. He's obviously a soldier by virtue of the title colonel, and he's a Mexican civilian official. So there is no separation. Okay. So these Anglo settlers were really upset about all of this stuff. And as a result, in June 1832, a party of Anglo-Texans from around Anahuac and Brazoria, Texas, marched on Bradburn's garrison, ready and intent on battle. There was no mistaking what these people were trying to do. They wanted a fight. And as they waited, they issued a document known as the Turtle Bayou Resolutions in June of 1832. The resolutions held that they, the war party, these people who were demanding the release of Travis, they were not, quote, vigilantes, nor was this an uprising on their part, but rather they said, we are a group of quote unquote Mexican citizens who are demanding our constitutional rights, and they added to this that their cause was in sympathy to that of the Federalists, and the leader of the Federalist party in Mexico, Juan Antonio Lopez, he's Santa Anna. Now, I'm not we haven't really talked much about him other than when I mentioned him during the revolution to free Mexico from Spain, but he's going to be a huge figure coming up. Santa Anna is the leader of the Federalist faction in the Mexican government, and they said we're in sympathy to that. So they are tying their cause to the Federalist movement. Higher authorities stepped in this case. They replaced Bradburn, looked at it and said, this is simply a matter of keeping the peace, so we're going to replace Bradburn. And they avoided bloodshed by ordering the release of Travis and anyone else that Bradburn had arrested. Now, while this was a successful maneuver on their part, the radicals never really gained a ton of popular support. This war party gained this immediate immediate sort of prominence, but they don't have a ton of popular support, meaning the people are not behind them. Much more popular among Texans was the so-called peace faction. Okay. Now, this peace faction was led by Stephen F. Austin himself. And as they saw it, the best way to work with the Mexican government and to get any sort of changes being done was, we're going to look for solutions to grievances. We're going to work through established political channels rather than, raising posses and going out to fight like Travis's war party had done. On October 1st, 1832, delegates from a number of Anglo settlements met at San Felipe de Austin to draft petitions that requested redress for some of their basic issues. But the big thing that they wanted was the removal of the law of April 6th, 1830, which we talked about in a previous lecture. That was by far their most important quote unquote demand. Now, to be clear, the meeting of the peace faction and their meeting to draft petitions was not actually legal, technically speaking. At best, it was extra legal. Remember, it's not illegal. There's no law preventing it, but it's certainly happening outside of the law, making it extra legal at best. According to Mexican law at this time, the types of petitions that the peace faction wanted, these were to originate within the ayuntamientos themselves, not with quote unquote the people. So there is no such thing as, for lack of a better term, the American tradition of initiative where the people propose their laws. Now, while sympathetic to their movement, the jefe de politico of Bexar, Ramon Musquiz, he obeyed the law. He followed the letter of the law when it came to these petitions that they were submitting, and he refused to forward the petitions to the governor of Coahuila y Tejas. By late 1832, the leading citizens of Bexar, most prominently Juan Seguin and Jose Maria Balmaceda, met in San Antonio to express their own grievances to the state government at Saltillo, to the state government. So now they are directly coming in to the state government. They argued against the constant intervention of the national government into state affairs, things like the colonization program. They said, we can't have the national government of Mexico constantly coming into Coahuila y Tejas and taking over this process or dictating this process to us. And they also claimed that the law of April 6th, 1830, essentially told useful capitalists, do not come to Texas because you're not going to make it here. The laws are against you. They also asked for bilingual administrators. They asked for more judges. They asked for better militia protection from Native Americans, and they wanted more tax exemptions. This, along with the petitions that I mentioned were rejected by Musquiz, were part of a groundswell of federalism throughout Mexico in 1832. Now, because of this, ayuntamientos in Goliad, Nacogdoches, and San Felipe endorsed this group of petitions, the ones that were being led by this group of people who notably were Tejanos. So now you've got ayuntamientos supporting the petitions. And because of that, because the ayuntamientos are adopting these and sending them to Musquiz, Musquiz says, okay, I'm going to send them along because now it has actually complied with the law. So Musquiz forwards these along to the governor of Coahuila y Tejas, but he also sends it along with a letter of explanation. And this letter of explanation is, I think it's fair to call it equal parts explanation and warning, because what Musquiz argued was that the Tejanos had in fact adopted a more boisterous tone than they had ever adopted before. Sorry, I accidentally hit the advance button there. They were adopting a more boisterous tone than they had ever done before. But this tone was designed to remedy a situation that was otherwise headed toward Anglo attempts to separate Tejas from Coahuila. So Musquiz said, look, yes, they're being a little louder than normal, but this isn't something to be afraid of. What we really need to be afraid of is that Anglos are trying to create a separate Tejas from Coahuila y Tejas. So that's the fear. That's the problem. Okay. And he assured the governor as well that Tejanos sought reform. They did not seek separation. Tejanos understood that if Tejas became a separate state, so if there's no Coahuila y Tejas and there's a separate Coahuila and a separate Tejas, they understood, the Tejanos did, that Anglos, not Tejanos, would dominate the politics of that new state. Now, as all of this has happened, as all of these things are being sent, as the ayuntamientos are supporting these things, as the petitions are being sent, very little had changed throughout all of this with the consultations, as they were called, these meetings where they're talking about petitions. They were called consultations, and nothing's really happening with them. So the Anglos held another meeting at San Felipe de Austin again in April of 1833. This time there were more attendees than just Stephen F. Austin's peace faction. This time, at this second consultation, as it was referred to, there were people who opposed Austin's ideas of peace and conciliation. Okay, these were the people that you see pictured on the screen here, William and John Wharton, a guy named David Burnett, and the former governor of Tennessee, who was now himself a Texas colonist, a guy named Sam Houston. And Sam Houston was a very recent arrival to Texas at this point. This second consultation had a new provision. It clearly stated that they favor the division of Coahuila y Tejas, arguing that a separate Tejas would and should have political autonomy to make its own decisions about its economic well-being. Now, realistically, they also wanted confirmation that slavery and colonization would continue without change. But they're saying this is necessary for quote-unquote economic well-being. Now, as things stood at that moment, the rivalry between the Federalists and the Centralists in Coahuila had pretty much quieted Anglo and Tejano demands on slavery. So they didn't really have much of a voice in the national government, in Mexico's national government. So they argued that only by separating Texas would it be possible for there to be a real program of economic progress. Once the second consultation was over, the draftees, the delegates at this second consultation drafted Stephen F. Austin. They drafted a guy named Erasmo Seguin. They drafted Dr. James B. Miller and sent all three of them to Mexico City to take their grievances directly to the government, because the national government would be the body that makes the decision. Do we separate Coahuila y Tejas or not? Now, they draft all three of these people, but only Austin makes the trip. That's why I didn't even bother to put the other guys on the screen, because Austin is the only one who actually makes the trip to Mexico City. Now, as far as the liberals, as far as the Federalists within Mexico's government, Mexico in 1832 elects Santa Anna as president. He takes office in 1833. He takes office as a liberal. Okay. Now, back in Coahuila, liberals are immediately, as I mentioned here, they're arranging for the state Congress to petition the national government to repeal the law of April 6, 1830. They had allies from the region in the national government by the summer of 1833. They had people like Gomez Farias, who Santa Anna appointed as acting president, because inexplicably Santa Anna won the election as president and then said, I'm going to take a step back and kind of retreat into private life, and I'm going to have this guy, as I mentioned, he's going to have Farias be the quote acting president. The central, the Coahuila, the Congress also had Lorenzo de Zavala as an ally within the Federalist government. So Austin goes to Mexico City thinking things are going to be fine. He arrives in Mexico City, and in May of 1834, Mexico's Senate does in fact revoke the section of the law of April 6th, 1830, because, as they saw it, it was a hindrance to the Anglo immigration that was successfully contributing to the overall economy. So they they repeal that part of the law. However, Austin wound up failing at gaining a separate Tejas. The Senate refused to even consider this. And when the officials in Mexico City discovered letters between Austin and the San Antonio Ayuntamiento advocating separatism, they wound up throwing Austin in jail. So Stephen F. Austin is now imprisoned in Mexico City over this whole problem. Now, despite this, despite Austin being jailed, despite his failure here, Coahuila remained committed to liberal legislation as the national government abided by the centralist stance on on colonization and slavery. New acts in the Coahuila legislature included the acceptance of English as an illegal language in Coahuila y Tejas. Now, remember, when you think back to what was going on when Anglos were allowed into Coahuila y Tejas, they were required to learn Spanish. Well, now they're saying you don't have to do that. We will allow the legality of English in Coahuila y Tejas. They also are going to get the government to commit to increasing representation for Tejas in the greater Coahuila y Tejas legislature. And finally, they're going to create within Coahuila y Tejas the Department of the Brazos with a capital at San Felipe de Austin, extending from Nacogdoches to the north-south line from the coast to the Red River, just beyond Bexar and Goliad. And then there's going to be a third zone called the Department of Bexar, which included present-day San Antonio and extended down to the Nueces River, basically around Corpus Christi. Now, the thing that we haven't really discussed here very much is the ethnic makeup of Coahuila y Tejas and Texas specifically. We've been talking about Anglo settlers. We've been talking about African-American slaves in the sort of abstract, but we haven't really been talking much about the real ethnic makeup of Coahuila y Tejas. So we need to, or Texas. So we need to take a couple of minutes and talk about that. As far as African Americans in Texas, life there was far different for African Americans and people of African descent. It was far different for them under Mexican rule. Anglos had already essentially maintained slavery in Texas, regardless of what Mexico's laws were. By 1836, the number of enslaved Texans was at about 5,000. About 5,000 African Americans were enslaved in Texas. They are African Americans. I'm not using that term as a sort of, modern term. They're peoples of African descent in the Americas. They are African Americans. Now, as previously discussed, the argument for slavery boiled down to economic development. Texans said we cannot have economic development without slavery. So Texans are absolutely committed to maintaining slavery. By 1836, on the eve of the Texas Revolution, both Tejas and Coahuilan leaders echoed this. So both Coahuila and Tejas agreed, we've got to maintain slavery here. Now, while most Mexican officials, whether they were centralists, conservatives, whether they were liberal federalists, most Mexican officials were truly abolitionists. And when I say that, I mean that they were personally abolitionists. However, they also, while believing this in their hearts, they also, for the most part, accepted the argument that Coahuila y Tejas could not survive without slavery. So whether they were personally abolitionists or not, they accepted the argument that slavery needed to be maintained. Now, as far as Tejanos in Texas, most Texans of Mexican origin lived in the ranching areas of Central and South Texas. Tejano settlements included places like San Antonio, where the Tejano population was about 2,500, Goliad, where it was about 700, Nacogdoches, about 537. Another approximately 2,000 lived in Laredo near the Rio Grande. Tejanos also worked as tradesmen in the various settlements through these areas. In the countryside, many Tejanos actually worked as laborers for rancheros. These Tejano ranch laborers captured a type of cattle that was called Mesteños. These Mesteños were branded livestock that were running wild. So having a brand on the cattle meant that they actually did belong to somebody. But since they were running wild, a lot of ranchers would round up these branded cattle, sell them on the black market, and as they saw it, it was kind of a victimless crime. So a lot of Tejanos worked capturing these Mesteños. Many others were farmers, although to be clear, even though there were lots of farmers, lots of Tejano farmers, their farming barely, in many cases, barely reached subsistence level. So they had enough to live on, but that was about it. As far as Native Americans in Texas, by the 1820s, most Native Americans had been driven out of Texas. In 1824, I think I mentioned this earlier, Austin's colony launched an offensive that forced the Karankawa, for the most part, out of Texas. By 1827, Karankawa had been forced southward from San Felipe to Austin and numbered fewer than 800. So they were almost completely gone in Texas. Plains Indians like the Comanche and right next to them, the Apache, they remained tied to their traditions and to their customs while developing their skills as cattle and livestock rustlers. These Apache and Comanche frequently traded with Anglo traders, primarily trading for firearms. The Comanche in particular had been very successful at arresting any sort of westward development in Tejas. So there were basically no ranches or towns west of San Antonio. San Antonio was basically the dividing line. You had Texas extending westward to San Antonio, and then beyond that, it's essentially wild territory. Okay. Now, the Caddos were at one point the most numerous and probably most successful Native Americans in Texas. They suffered greatly from a new scourge. The Caddo suffered from alcoholism, courtesy of Anglo trade. The Caddo numbers by the time the late 1820s rolled around were less than 300. Now, where there was some growth in diversity, occurred in the 1819 and 1820, when Cherokee, of all people, began arriving in Texas under pressure from the United States and various Western state governments within the United States. The Cherokee settled on what had at one point been Caddo land. Cherokee leader named Jewel set up these settlements on the Trinity River near present-day Texas. The Cherokee had a lot of problems with the Comanche and the Apache, and eventually relocated to the area around present-day Van Zant, Texas. Other Indian groups that were moving in the same manner were groups like Shawnee, Delaware, Alabama Coshada Indians, and Kickapoo Indians. But the point is that Texas is almost exclusively quote unquote Anglo country by this point. There are a lot of different groups in Texas/Tejas. We've got African Americans in large numbers. We've got Tejanos in large numbers, but at least half of the population of Texas was Anglo. So all of these groups not only function as minority populations, but they're also they're minority in the part of the Tejanos, and they have literally no rights within the structure of the government in the case of African Americans. Now, we're going to see a rise of centralists starting in 1834, in May of 1834, to be precise. Santa Anna had, quote, retired after his election, but he decided to return to public life in May of 1834, specifically to oust Gómez Farías, his acting president. Now, he did this because Farías's liberalism had alienated both the church, the Catholic Church, and the state military. Mexico's national military had been alienated by Farías. So Santa Anna comes back in, reestablishes control, and one of the first things he does is he abolishes the Constitution of 1824. Now, he also is going to initiate elections for a new Congress. Now, I'm saying a new Congress for a reason. This is going to be, as Santa Anna envisioned it, it's going to be a provisional Congress. It's not meant ever to be the Congress. Okay. So this is going to be a provisional Congress, and this provisional Congress is going to be comprised entirely of conservatives, of centralists, because Santa Anna is now a centralist. And in 1835, with this new Congress, the Congress establishes a centralist state as opposed to a federalist state in Mexico. They dissolve all of the state legislatures. They tell Coahuila y Tejas, all of these individual states within Mexico's federal system, they tell them, you are no longer separate sovereign states within a federal system. What Santa Anna referred to these areas as is military departments. So there is the military department of Coahuila y Tejas. Now, because it's a military department, that means while they may have a civilian governor, there ultimately will be a presidential appointee in charge of these areas. So they may have a civilian governor in Coahuila y Tejas, but Santa Anna will appoint a presidential representative who will be over the governor of Coahuila y Tejas. Now, while some states flat out rebelled against all of this, Baja California, for example, rebelled against this very strongly. Coahuila y Tejas was kind of mixed about all of this stuff. Liberal politicians obviously denounced what was going on here, and they denounced what Santa Anna was doing, and they flat out said, we will not obey Santa Anna, nor any of his directives, nor any of his officials. In April of 1835, the new National Congress, that provisional Congress that Santa Anna created, passed two laws. One would sell 400 leagues of public land to meet public expenditures. And the people in Coahuila y Tejas flat out looked at this and said, well, the problem here is Santa Anna. We wouldn't have this problem if it weren't Santa Anna, if it weren't for what Santa Anna was doing. They also, this was the Coahuila Congress, the Coahuila y Tejas Congress. They also decided they were going to set aside another 400 leagues of public land to sell to anyone who would, quote unquote, fight Indians. Now, it's important to note here that those are the only people that are going to get access to these lands. They specifically, even though they have flat out said we are not going to support Santa Anna and we're having trouble paying our expenses because of what Santa Anna is doing, they are not interested in raising money for the purpose of fighting Santa Anna. So they're not actually creating a force yet to fight the Mexican government. Now, Anglos jumped at these land sales. And about 1,000 Anglos offered themselves up as a quote unquote company to fight Indians. Now, the central government of Mexico feared militias like this one that had just emerged here. They feared that militias like this would be used, to go out and fight Indians. That's their stated purpose. But they said that soon enough, that Indian problem would be handled, and those militias would then turn around and fight the Mexican government. So they don't want that. So Domingo de Ugartequea, pictured on the screen here, he is the military commandant appointed over Coahuila y Tejas. He calls on Mexican General Martin Perfecto de Cos to send reinforcements to the north. Now, Cos relayed this request directly to Santa Anna. Santa Anna gets the report, gets the request, and almost immediately, because of this, a report emerges that Mexico's army is on the move. They are heading to Texas, and they are going to put all of this stuff down, any of this sentiment down. A group of Texans commanded by William Barrett Travis, we mentioned him before with the War Party. This group of Texans is going to proceed to Anahuac with a cannon on June 30th, 1835. Now, when they get to Anahuac with this cannon, they immediately force this tiny Mexican garrison that's in Anahuac, they force them to surrender. Now, while their stated reason, Travis and this whole group of people who are marching on this garrison to Anahuac, they state flat out, our reason for all of this, our reason for marching is about taxation. It was clear that what they were doing was trying to gather support for a secession and independence movement. Many Texans were still pretty well divided on all of this, and some even went as far as trying to assure Mexican officials that the Travis March was in no way about separation, but it's very clear that that's what it was about. But to Mexican officials who were already pretty much sick and tired of what's going on, Anahuac represented the beginning of the revolt in their eyes. Texas authorities made it worse. They step in and make it even worse. They refuse, even though they're obligated to by Mexico's laws, they refuse to arrest the quote-unquote Anahuac agitators, claiming that popular support is a problem. They say if we arrest all of these people, then the people, generally speaking, are going to turn against us. We can't do all of this. The radicals within the War Party called for, as they put it, a third consultation, and plainly stated, the third consultation leaders plainly stated that the surrender of their leaders was not up for discussion. So they said, if you want them, we're not going to give them up. If you want them, you've got to come and take them. Now, that come and take it attitude is going to wind up becoming a symbol of, quote unquote, the Texas Revolution, but not because of Travis and the leaders here. In September 1835, coinciding with all of this stuff, it is literally just a coincidence, Stephen F. Austin, who had finally been released from the prison in Mexico, he comes back. He finally makes it back to Texas, and he is furious over his treatment. And now, instead of being part of the peace party, he says, nope, I'm with the War Party now. So Santa Anna had changed sides in all of this, and now Stephen F. Austin has changed sides, and he is fully in step with the War Party. If at least not in name, even if he's not putting out things saying, I am Stephen F. Austin and I am with the War Party, he is in ideals with the War Party. On September 20th, 1835, as I mentioned, General Perfecto de Cos, pictured on the screen here, landed with soldiers and marched into Goliad, reinforcing the city there, and then marched on to Bear. Cities along the way began to discuss how they should respond. How would they respond? How could they respond even? And they start, and they're aided by no shortage of rumors. There are tons of rumors going around, from Cos is there to arrest the agitators to he's here to oppress Texans more generally. There was also a rumor that Cos was there to by force free the enslaved. There was another rumor that he was there to, quote, lay waste to Texas. But before anything could actually be discussed, the first episode actually occurs between the Anglos and the Mexican army at Gonzales. Lieutenant Francisco de Castañeda, I wish I had could have found a good picture of him. I couldn't. But he's a lieutenant within in the Mexican army. He arrived at the end of September to Gonzales, and he requested that the people of Gonzales give back a cannon that the Mexican army had loaned them, quote unquote, loaned them for their protection. They said, we'll give you this cannon for protection from Indians. Well, now you've got these people in Texas who are, as they see it, they are against the Mexican government. And here comes the Mexican army to support what the Mexican government wants. And the Mexican army is saying, we'd like to have our cannon back. And the negotiations were absurd in all of this stuff. You can imagine that Texans were saying, absolutely not. We're not going to give you this cannon back, because we look at it as absolutely a measure of safety, if not against Native Americans, against you. So Castañeda does try to negotiate, but they're just a complete failure. Castañeda himself believed that the army would actually be fired upon if they crossed the river to go into Gonzales itself. So nothing really winds up happening because of that. However, on October 2nd, 1835, the rebels used this exact same cannon that they're negotiating on to fire on Castañeda. And then the rebels draped a white banner over this artillery piece, over the cannon, with the wording, quote unquote, "Come and take it," printed on the canvas. I'm sure some of you have seen bumper stickers and the like. If you've driven for even 10 minutes in the state of Texas, you've seen the bumper stickers that represent the "Come and Take It" flag that was thrown over this cannon. The rebels demanded, after firing on Castañeda, they demanded that Castañeda surrender, and they continued firing and firing and firing. Castañeda himself was under orders not to surrender, which Castañeda thought was ridiculous, because he said, we can't win here. We're literally outgunned. So ultimately, Castañeda decided that the best course of action, if I'm literally not allowed to surrender, he says, well, then the heck with this. I'm leaving. I'm just going to leave Gonzales. And he just says, we're out of here. By the end of October of 1835, rebels had also captured Goliad. They had captured the Presidio at Goliad, the soldiers inside, the Mexican soldiers inside at Goliad. This wound up giving the rebels a cache of weapons that would arm them pretty well. This would also allow them to mount a much more efficient defense against Cos. Potentially, and especially what they were worried about was that Cos would bring in new troops. So they figure, well, now we're armed in that eventuality. Stephen F. Austin also is going to command a militia that's going to move into San Antonio and quarantine the city of San Antonio. Austin did not stay very long in San Antonio. Austin wound up being sent on a diplomatic mission to the United States, and the militia elected Edward Burleson, the guy pictured at the top of the screen, as their new commander. Burleson decided that having a siege in the winter was a bad idea. He says, we're not going to siege anywhere. However, Ben Milam, a guy named Ben Milam, convinced Burleson to allow the raising of a new company specifically to try to take Bayard. So Milam's argument is, okay, if you don't want to, then let me raise some guys and we'll go and we'll assault Bayard. On December 5th, 1835, Milam did, in fact, lead the assault on Bayard. since Cos, commanding Mexico's forces, was so isolated and he had literally no chance of resupply or reinforcements. He wound up surrendering to these forces. He succumbed on December 11th after a 6-day siege. The rebels forced Cos to agree to respect the Constitution of 1824, to leave Bear and head back down south to Mexico City and quote unquote never return. In the meantime, 58 delegates from 12 Texas communities got together at the quote unquote consultation of 1835, meeting from November 3rd to November 14th. They declared their commitment to the Constitution of 1824, something that they hoped would gain support from the liberal/federalist community in Mexico's government. They also, I mentioned that Stephen F. Austin had been sent on a diplomatic mission. The diplomatic mission was to gauge American interest in annexation of Texas. So before Texas is even quote unquote liberated, before it's free, before it's declared secession from Mexico, what have you, Texans are already thinking ahead to how do we get to be part of the United States. So it's no wonder, if you start thinking about these sorts of things, it's no wonder that Mexico looked a little bit askew at the United States throughout this entire period. Now, this is going to lead directly into the Texas Revolution, which will be the topic of our next lecture.